The first thing that hits you isn't the sight, it's the sound. A low, constant roar that isn't quite human. It's the sound of 50,000 souls merged into a single, hungry entity. It vibrates through the stone beneath your feet, up your spine, and settles in the base of your skull. It's a sound of anticipation. Then comes the smell, an acrid, almost metallic mixture of sweat, sawdust, exotic animal musk, and something else, something coppery and sweet. The smell of blood, both fresh and stale, baked into the very sand of the arena floor by the unforgiving sun. This is the Roman Colosseum, and you've been sold a lie about what it truly was. Hollywood, in its endless quest for heroes, sold you the image of noble warriors fighting for freedom, of righteous gladiators defying corrupt emperors. It was a comforting lie, a story of honor found in the face of death. But the truth, the raw, unfiltered truth that history tries to forget, is far more disturbing. The Roman arena was not a stage for heroes. It was a psychological machine, meticulously engineered for a single purpose: to desensitize an entire civilization to the act of killing. It was a theater where cruelty was performed as high art, and the suffering of living beings was the main attraction. The acts that we now consider to have gone too far were not aberrations. They were the machine's intended product. They were the inevitable result of a society suffering from a full-blown addiction to violence, an addiction that demanded, year after year, a stronger dose. This is not a story about warriors. It is a story about that addiction. Our journey today is a descent, a peeling back of the layers of this grand illusion. We will begin in the shallowest circle of this Roman hell, the carefully orchestrated myth of the gladiator, and we will descend deeper into the darker, more depraved circles of the arena, through the industrial-scale slaughter of the natural world, into the ghastly theater of staged executions, and finally into the heart of the abyss, where the emperors themselves became the star monsters of their own horrifying shows. This is the story of how a society, in its relentless pursuit of entertainment, perfected the art of inhumanity. The gateway drug for Rome's addiction to violence was the munus, the classic gladiatorial game. On the surface, it was presented as a spectacle of martial prowess, a rigid system governed by rules, referees, and the potential for glory. This was the grand illusion, the carefully constructed lie that allowed 50,000 citizens to watch men kill each other and still consider themselves civilized. To understand the depths of depravity the arena would eventually reach, we must first dissect the lie that made it all possible. The gladiator himself was a living paradox. He was simultaneously a superstar and a social pariah. Legally, he was a slave, branded with the status of infamia, a term that literally translates to disgrace. He was legally dead, stripped of all civil rights, standing on the same social rung as prostitutes and actors. He could be bought, sold, and killed for profit. Yet, in the arena, he could achieve a level of fame that rivaled modern athletes. Children played with gladiator action figures made of clay. Women swooned over the most famous fighters, with graffiti from Pompeii revealing love letters scrawled on public walls, declarations of passion for men they only knew as killing machines. This paradox was the engine of the game. It created a figure that the crowd could both idolize for his strength and despise for his status. It made his death permissible, even desirable. The schools, or ludi, where these men were trained were not athletic facilities. They were prisons run by a man known as a lanista. The lanista was a figure of public contempt, a flesh peddler who profited from death. Yet he was a necessary evil, the supplier for Rome's favorite pastime. Inside these schools, men were stripped of their names and given new ones, their past lives erased. They were fed a specific high-carbohydrate diet, the gladiatorium saginam, designed to build a layer of fat over their muscles. This wasn't for their health. A layer of fat protected nerves and arteries from superficial cuts, prolonging the fight, making the first sight of blood less likely to be fatal, and thus creating a better, bloodier show. Every aspect of their existence was optimized for the spectacle of their potential death. The pairings in the arena were a science. The organizers, the editors, wouldn't simply throw two men into the ring. They would stage matchups as a modern fight promoter would, creating narratives and contrasts. The most iconic of these was the battle between the retiarius and the secutor. The retiarius, the netman, was lightly armored, equipped only with a trident, a dagger, and a weighted net. He was quick, agile, a symbol of the sea, of cunning over brute force. His opponent, the secutor, or pursuer, was the polar opposite. He was heavily armored, his helmet a smooth, featureless dome with only two small eye holes, designed to prevent the prongs of the trident from finding purchase. He carried a large shield and a short sword, the gladius. He was a relentless, heavily armed killing machine, a symbol of the earth, of overwhelming power. This was not a fair fight. It was a perfectly balanced equation of death. It was a clash of styles designed to create a dynamic, unpredictable narrative. Would the quick retiarius ensnare his slow-moving foe, or would the relentless secutor corner and crush his elusive prey? This was the genius of the Roman games. They turned killing into a complex drama, filled with suspense and tactical intrigue. It gave the crowd an intellectual excuse to crave the visceral thrill of the kill. The economics behind these games were staggering. Staging a major munus could cost a fortune, an investment that could make or break a politician's career. It was a brutal form of venture capital, where the commodity being traded was human life. But the true psychological transaction, the one that cemented the arena's hold on the Roman soul, happened at the end of the fight. When a gladiator was defeated and brought to his knees, he would raise a finger, appealing for mercy. The decision did not rest with the emperor or the fight's sponsor. It rested with the 50,000 people in the stands. This was the moment of the pollis verso, the turning of the thumb. While its exact gesture is still debated by historians, whether it was thumb up for death and down for life, or hidden in the fist for mercy, its meaning was absolute. The crowd, the teeming mass of ordinary Roman citizens, became God. Imagine it. You are a baker, a blacksmith, a clerk. You live a life of little power or consequence. But for this one moment, you, along with 50,000 of your peers, hold the fate of another human being in your hands. Your gesture, multiplied by the thousands, will decide whether he lives to see another sunrise or bleeds out on the hot sand. This was the ultimate drug. The power of a god condensed into a single gesture, delivered from the cheap seats. What does that do to the soul of a civilization when the act of granting or denying life becomes its favorite form of popular entertainment? It makes them numb. It makes them hungry for more. This, the classic gladiatorial contest, was merely the first circle of hell. It was the honorable face of a deeply dishonorable enterprise. It established the rules and the rituals that made the killing palatable. But it was a spectacle that, by its very nature, suffered from diminishing returns. Once the crowd had tasted the power of deciding a man's fate, the simple drama of a one-on-one fight was no longer enough. The craving had been created. The addiction had taken root. And for the Roman mind, the dosage had to increase. The machine needed more fuel, more novelty, more blood. The illusion of honor had served its purpose, and now the descent into true barbarism could begin. If the gladiatorial games were the appetizer that accustomed the Roman palate to the taste of death, the venacione, or wild beast hunts, were the main course. This was where the illusion of a fair contest was stripped away, replaced by a raw, overwhelming display of imperial power. The Venations were not hunts in any recognizable sense of the word. They were a form of theatrical extermination, a declaration of war not against a rival army, but against the natural world itself. They were a message, written in the blood of 10,000 animals, that Rome's dominion was absolute, that every creature on earth, no matter how majestic or fearsome, existed for one purpose: to die for the amusement of its citizens. The sheer scale of these events is difficult for the modern mind to comprehend. This was not a matter of releasing a few lions into the arena. This was a logistical operation of staggering complexity and expense, a dark mirror of the Roman military's efficiency. For months leading up to a major festival, the gears of empire would turn to a single, savage purpose. Roman legions, provincial governors, and allied kings across 3 continents were tasked with a grim harvest. Squadrons of hunters and trappers would spread across the plains of Numidia, the forests of Gaul, and the mountains of Parthia. They captured not just lions and tigers, but a veritable Noah's Ark of doomed creatures: bears, leopards, wild boars, elephants, rhinos, hippos, crocodiles, and even ostriches. These animals were not killed in their native lands. They were captured alive, a far more difficult and dangerous task, and subjected to a long, agonizing journey back to the heart of the empire. Caged and terrified, they were transported for thousands of miles on ships and ox carts, their spirits broken long before they ever set foot on the sand of the Colosseum. The mortality rate during this transit was appalling. For every magnificent beast that was eventually paraded before the roaring crowds, countless others perished from stress, starvation, or disease in the dark holds of ships. The entire process was a testament to Roman engineering and a complete disregard for life. The spectacle that awaited them was a vision of hell. When the Emperor Titus inaugurated the Colosseum in 80 AD, the celebratory games lasted for 100 days. On a single day during that festival, an estimated 9,000 animals were slaughtered. Think about that number: not 90, not 900, but 9,000 creatures, many of whom the average Roman had never seen before, killed in a matter of hours. A century later, during the Emperor Trajan's celebration of his victory in Dacia, the games ran for 123 days and saw the deaths of over 11,000 animals. This relentless carnage had a real, permanent impact on the world. The Roman arena was an ecological black hole. It consumed the fauna of the empire at an unsustainable rate. The demand was so voracious that entire species were wiped out from vast regions. The elephants of North Africa, famously used by Hannibal, were hunted to extinction. The lions that once roamed the Balkans and the Near East vanished forever. The Caspian tiger, a magnificent subspecies, was driven into oblivion, its last refuge hunted down for the games. The hippopotamus disappeared from its habitats along the lower Nile. The Romans were not merely killing individual animals. They were systematically erasing entire branches of the tree of life to fuel a few days of public entertainment. The creativity invested in this slaughter was as boundless as it was depraved. The arena was transformed by a legion of engineers and artists. Vast painted backdrops would be erected, recreating lush forests or arid deserts. Complex machinery hidden beneath the arena floor, a system of elevators and trapdoors, could make trees, hills, and even streams appear as if by magic. This was not a simple fight in a sandy pit. It was an immersive, theatrical experience. And within these artificial worlds, the Romans staged their monstrous ballets. They pitted animals against each other in unnatural and cruel pairings: a lion against a tiger, a bear against a bull. They would chain different species together, forcing them to fight to the death. But the main event was the bestiarius, the human beast hunter. Unlike the gladiator, the bestiarius was often a trained professional, armed with spears, bows, and daggers. While some were criminals condemned to face the beasts unarmed, many were celebrated specialists. They would perform incredible feats of skill, killing charging lions with a single spear thrust or leaping over raging bulls. The crowd would roar its approval at these displays of human dominance over nature. But even here, the Romans found ways to escalate the novelty. They would tie a man to a stake and have bears maul him. They would strap criminals to rudimentary machines that would fling them into the jaws of starved predators. What does it do to the collective psyche of a people to witness such carnage on a regular, state-sanctioned basis? It does something profound and insidious. It reinforces the idea that Rome is the center of the universe and that all other life is expendable. It creates a profound disconnect from the natural world, transforming it from a source of wonder and respect into a mere warehouse of props for a bloody show. The roars of a dying lion or the trumpeting of a terrified elephant were no longer sounds of nature. They were the soundtrack to a fun day out. The Venations were the second deeper circle of the arena's hell. They took the desensitization that began with the gladiators and expanded it to an almost unimaginable scale. The crowd was now accustomed not just to man killing man, but to man systematically annihilating the animal kingdom for sport. The appetite for blood had grown, and the line of what was considered acceptable had been pushed further and further back. The Roman spectator was now conditioned to see life, in any form, as cheap. And with that conditioning firmly in place, the stage was set for the arena's most obscene and creative chapter: the transformation of capital punishment from a legal act into a grotesque form of public art. The descent was far from over. Here, in the third and deepest circle of the arena's everyday horrors, we arrive at the point where the thin veneer of sport or spectacle is finally burned away, revealing the truly monstrous heart of the Roman games. This is where the line between justice and entertainment, between punishment and performance, ceased to exist. The noontime executions, staged between the morning beast hunts and the afternoon gladiatorial contests, were not merely a method of capital punishment. They were a form of psychological warfare waged by the state upon its own citizens, a meticulously crafted art form where the medium was human suffering and the canvas was the Colosseum floor. This was the moment the Roman arena truly went too far, transforming the act of execution into a grotesque, surrealist nightmare that still beggars belief. The most infamous of these spectacles was the damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. This was a sentence reserved for the lowest dregs of society: runaway slaves, provincial rebels, and, most famously, members of forbidden religions like Christianity. The process was a study in calculated cruelty. The condemned, the naumachiae, were stripped of all dignity. They were marched into the arena, often naked, their bodies exposed to the jeers and ridicule of 50,000 spectators. They were frequently tied to stakes or pillars, rendered utterly helpless. Sometimes they were forced into elaborate contraptions designed to heighten the drama of their final moments. Then the gates would be opened. The animals, starved for days to ensure maximum ferocity, would emerge. The crowd was not watching a fight, they were watching a feeding. They were witnessing the systematic dismemberment of a living human being. The horror was the entire point. It was a visceral, unforgettable demonstration of the state's absolute power, the power to literally have you torn apart for the amusement of your fellow citizens. The screams of the dying were lost in the roar of the crowd. But even this straightforward brutality was not enough for the Roman imagination. The Emperor Nero, in his persecution of the Christians following the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, elevated this cruelty into a form of aesthetic decadence. The historian Tacitus, no friend to the Christians, was nonetheless appalled by what he witnessed. He describes how Nero used the condemned as living torches for his garden parties. This was the tunica molesta, the annoying shirt. Victims were coated in pitch, tar, and resin, nailed to crosses or stakes, and set ablaze. Their burning bodies provided the festive illumination for the emperor's evening entertainments. Think about this for a moment. This is a level of depravity that is almost impossible to process. The emperor and the Roman elite would stroll through the gardens, enjoying wine and conversation, their faces lit by the flickering light of agonizingly dying human beings. It represents the ultimate fusion of sadism and artistry, the transformation of human life into a disposable decoration. It was no longer about punishment. It was about finding new and ever more shocking ways to display the power over life and death. Yet, arguably the most diabolical innovation of the Roman arena was the ludi meridiani, or fatal charades. In these spectacles, the execution was disguised as a theatrical reenactment of a famous myth, a perverse play where the lead actor's death was horrifyingly real. This was the ultimate meta-spectacle. The crowd was watching a play, knowing that the death they were about to witness was not a special effect. It blurred the lines between fiction and reality in the most gruesome way imaginable. The condemned were forced to become actors in their own executions. A man might be dressed as the mythical hero Hercules, placed upon a funeral pyre, and burned alive before the cheering crowds. Another would be cast as Icarus, fitted with useless wings, and thrown from a great height to his death on the arena floor. The myth of Orpheus, the legendary musician who could charm wild beasts, was a particular favorite. A criminal would be tied to a rock with a lyre in his hand, and a starved bear would be released to maul him to death. The bloody irony was the entire point of the show. The level of detail and cruelty in these fatal charades knew no bounds. Historians like Martial and Tertullian describe scenarios of breathtaking inhumanity. There are accounts of a criminal cast as the bandit Lord Laureolus, who was famously crucified and then torn apart by wild animals in the original myth. The Romans recreated this scene with a real man, nailing him to a cross and then letting boars and bears disembowel him. Perhaps the most sickening of all was the perversion of the sacred act of marriage. The historian Suetonius recounts a spectacle in which a male prisoner, playing the role of the castrated priest of the goddess Cebu, was forced into a mock wedding ceremony with a female prisoner. The ceremony would be played out for the crowd's amusement, a grotesque parody of one of society's most fundamental rights. And at its conclusion, both bride and groom would be brutally executed. This was the moral nadir of the Roman arena. It was a place where the foundational stories of their own culture were twisted into scripts for real-life snuff films. It demonstrates a society so profoundly jaded, so desperate for new forms of stimulation, that it could only be entertained by the absolute violation of every sacred and human boundary. The crowd was no longer just watching a death. They were applauding the cleverness of its staging. They were critiquing the performance. The suffering of the victim had become entirely secondary to the artistic merit of their execution. This third circle represents a society that has lost its soul. The desensitization was now complete. The Roman citizen had been trained, step by step, to view human life as raw material for entertainment. They had been taught that there was no act of cruelty so extreme that it could not be justified in the name of a good show. But there was one final circle to descend into, a place where the logic of the arena finally collapsed under the weight of its own insanity. This was the abyss where the supreme ruler of the world, the emperor himself, decided to step out of the royal box and become the monster on the sand. In this final suffocating circle of hell, the internal logic of the Roman arena, twisted as it was, finally shatters. The Colosseum was, for all its horrors, a tool of the state. It was a mechanism for social control, a display of imperial power, and a release valve for the masses. But what happens when the ultimate authority, the emperor himself, is insane? What happens when a man with the power of a god and the impulses of a monster decides that the arena is no longer a tool of the state, but his own personal playground? In this final descent, we witness the system turning on itself, as the ultimate symbols of power, the emperors Caligula and Commodus, step onto the sand and transform the theater of cruelty into a theater of the absurd, revealing the terminal sickness at the heart of the Roman Empire. Gaius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, better known by his childhood nickname Caligula, was the first to truly demonstrate how the arena could become a stage for a single man's psychosis. His reign was short, lasting less than 4 years, but his name has become a byword for decadent madness. The historians Suetonius and Cassius Dio paint a portrait of an emperor who delighted in erasing the line between the spectator and the spectacle. For Caligula, the crowd was not an audience to be pleased, but another set of props for his horrifying games. During one series of games, the supply of criminals condemned to be fed to the beasts had run out. A normal organizer would have simply ended that portion of the show. Caligula, however, was not a normal organizer. Annoyed by the interruption, he surveyed the crowd, pointed to an entire section of spectators and commanded his guards, "Throw them all to the beasts." To prevent them from crying out or protesting their innocence, he ordered that their tongues be cut out first. The guards complied. An entire block of Roman citizens who had come for a day's entertainment were dragged from their seats, mutilated, and fed to starved lions, simply to satisfy the momentary whim of their emperor. On another occasion, during a particularly hot day, Caligula reportedly ordered the great awnings that shaded the Colosseum to be drawn back, and the exits to be barred. He then sat back in his shaded royal box to watch as thousands of his own citizens suffered from heat stroke and dehydration, their panicked attempts to escape providing him with a novel form of amusement. These were not acts of political calculation. They were acts of pure, unadulterated sadism. Caligula had broken the unwritten contract of the games. The spectacle was no longer for the people were the spectacle. The machine designed to desensitize the masses had been hijacked by a man who saw no difference between a condemned criminal and a paying customer. More than a century later, the Emperor Commodus would drag the imperial office to its ultimate degradation, not through cruelty to the crowd, but through his own pathetic and narcissistic performances on the sand. Commodus, the son of the philosopher King Marcus Aurelius, was obsessed with the idea of being a real-life Hercules and the greatest gladiator of all time. He saw the arena as the only stage worthy of his divine talents. The very act of an emperor stepping into the ring as a gladiator was a profound shock to the Roman system. It was a complete violation of social order. An emperor was a god on earth. A gladiator was infamia, a social outcast legally equivalent to a prostitute. For the emperor to willingly take on the status of the lowest of the low was, to the Roman elite, an act of unforgivable sacrilege. It was as if a modern head of state had decided to become a professional wrestler, but infinitely more debasing. But Commodus's performances were not displays of courage. They were carefully staged farces designed to eliminate any possibility of risk. He would enter the arena clad in the finest armor, armed with the best weapons, to face opponents who were either hopelessly outmatched or had been secretly ordered to lose. He would fight gladiators who were armed with lead or wooden swords. He took great pleasure in executing amputees and cripples who were wheeled into the arena, defenseless, for him to heroically slay. His obsession with the venations was equally pathetic. He would stand on a raised, protected platform and shoot down animals with a bow and arrow, a feat requiring no particular bravery. He famously killed 100 bears in a single morning in this manner. He beheaded ostriches with specially designed crescent-shaped arrows, delighting in how the headless birds would continue to run around the arena for a few moments. To the stunned and silent Senate, whom he had forced to attend, he would hold up the severed head of an ostrich in one hand and his bloody sword in the other, implying that their heads could be next. The Roman people, for a time, cheered these displays, but even for them there was a limit. The final straw was Commodus's demand to be officially deified as a new Hercules and to be paid a record sum of 1,000,000 sesterces from the gladiatorial fund for one of his appearances. It was too much. The hero had become a clown. The divine emperor was now just a preening, overpaid performer. The spectacle had consumed its master. His narcissism had turned the terrifying power of the arena into a joke, and in doing so he had signed his own death warrant. He was assassinated shortly after by a cabal of conspirators that included his own wrestling partner, strangled in his bath, an ignominious end for a man who dreamed of being a god on the sand. The reigns of Caligula and Commodus represent the final, implosive stage of the arena's logic. The violence was no longer a tool to control the populace. It was the chaotic outburst of unchecked power. The gladiator was no longer a disposable slave. He was the emperor himself. The system had become a parody of its own monstrosity. This was not just a moral failing. It was a symptom of a deep-seated political and social rot. The Colosseum, which was built to project the strength and stability of the Roman Empire, had become the stage for its ultimate weakness, the madness of its own leaders. The descent was complete. We have journeyed through the circles of the Roman arena, from the calculated illusion of the gladiator's honor, down through the industrial-scale slaughter of the natural world, into the ghastly theater of fatal charades, and finally into the narcissistic abyss of the mad emperors. What we have witnessed is not a series of isolated atrocities, but a clear, terrifying trajectory. The story of a society's escalating addiction to violence, a hunger so profound that it constantly demanded more extreme, more novel, and more depraved forms of stimulation. The Colosseum, and the hundreds of arenas like it across the empire, were more than just buildings. They were furnaces of the human spirit, designed to burn away empathy and forge a populace hardened to the sight of suffering. They began as a political tool, a way to channel the masses' aggression and buy their loyalty with bread and blood. But the tool soon became the master. The need for the spectacle, for the ludi, became so ingrained in the Roman identity that the state was held hostage by the very addiction it had created. The games were a promise that could not be broken, a hunger that could never truly be satiated. The ultimate lesson of the Roman arena is not about the depravity of a long-dead empire. It is a timeless and chilling warning about the very nature of humanity. It reveals how perilously thin the veneer of civilization truly is, and how easily a society can be persuaded to abandon its moral compass when cruelty is rebranded as entertainment. The Romans were not innately more evil than we are. They were architects, poets, engineers, and lawmakers. Yet, these same people could spend an afternoon watching a man be torn apart by a bear in a reenactment of a myth, and call it culture. The arena teaches us that the capacity for monstrous behavior lies dormant within any society, waiting for the right combination of political power, mass media, and popular consensus to awaken it. Today, the Colosseum stands as a majestic ruin, a tourist attraction where millions pose for photographs. Its stones no longer echo with the roar of the crowd or the screams of the dying. But to believe that the spirit of the arena died with the fall of Rome is a profound and dangerous mistake. The arena has not disappeared, it has simply metastasized. It has changed its form. The fundamental human psychology it exploited is still very much with us. The thirst for spectacle, the thrill of the contest, the anonymous catharsis of the crowd, and the dark, quiet satisfaction of watching someone else's downfall. These impulses have not vanished. They thrive in the digital colosseums of our own age. We see echoes of it in the gladiatorial nature of our political discourse, in the public shaming rituals of social media, and in the way reality television monetizes human conflict and humiliation. The technology has changed, but the hunger remains. The arena is a reminder that any society that makes a commodity out of human suffering, no matter how trivial or well packaged, is walking down a very old and very dangerous road. The story of the Roman arena, therefore, is not just history. It is a mirror. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about ourselves, about the entertainment we consume, and about the lines we are willing to draw and erase for the sake of a good show. Our journey through history's darkest chapters is far from over. There are countless other stories, other warnings that lie buried, waiting to be unearthed. If you believe that understanding these uncomfortable truths is not about morbid curiosity, but about arming ourselves with the wisdom to recognize these ancient echoes in our own time, then join us. Subscribe and continue this vital exploration. Because history is never truly in the past. It is a living presence, and its most terrifying lessons are the ones we forget at our own peril.